In Alaska's interior, distance doesn't feel like a number. It feels like pressure. Roads flatten into white plates, river ice talks under the tires, and the wind carries quick sounds that don't match the calm on the map. After dark, these bush routes turn into long, empty corridors where small changes mean everything. A warning flag ripples before the gust arrives. A trap cabin reads warm even though the door is frozen shut. A radio repeats a caller's own ID under the Aurora. And a headlamp moves down a closed slope road without a body behind it. Tonight's accounts come from SAR notes, cabin logs, trucker rundowns, and pipeline checks pulled from late winter routes. One incident in this set was nearly removed from the record. You'll know which one when we reach it. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our daily true horror stories. And keep the bell on. We post every night. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. It helps the channel grow. All right, let's get into it. I was a park ranger, conducting a routine patrol of the trailheads. It was late autumn, well past midnight, and the air held a sharp, biting cold. My scanner suddenly crackled with a garbled, looping transmission. I was a park ranger, assigned to the more remote sections of the Appalachian Trail. My duties often involved late-night patrols, checking on shelters and trailheads, especially during the colder months. This particular night, the air was still and clear, barely above freezing, promising a heavy frost by dawn. I drove my service truck along the winding gravel roads, the headlights cutting through the deep forest. The isolation out here was profound, a constant companion. My scanner, usually a source of intermittent chatter, suddenly broke its silence. It was a distress call, or what sounded like one, but it was heavily distorted. The transmission was short, just a few words. Then it repeated itself. It was a loop, a fragment of a voice, barely a whisper over the static. I tried to adjust the squelch, but the sound persisted. A ghostly echo in the quiet cabin of the truck. This was not a typical radio anomaly. It felt different, more insistent, and it was coming from a direction I knew well. The Gap Lot trailhead. My routine patrols were usually predictable. I would check the parking lots for any vehicles left overnight, ensuring no one was stranded or in need of assistance. I would also inspect the trail registers at the shelters, looking for missing log entries or signs of trouble. The Gap Lot trailhead was a common starting point for longer hikes, a place where people often left their cars for days. It was a remote spot, several miles from the nearest highway, surrounded by dense forest. Cell service was non-existent, making the two-way radio my only reliable link to dispatch. I had been a ranger for many years, accustomed to the quiet hum of the forest at night. I knew the sounds of the wind, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal animals. I trusted my equipment and my training. The scanner was a critical piece of that equipment, and its behavior this night was unsettling. The looping call was persistent, a low thrum beneath the usual white noise. It was a sound that demanded attention, pulling me deeper into the night. I turned the truck onto the narrow access road leading to the Gap Lot. The gravel crunched under the tires, the only sound apart from the scanner's repeating fragment. My headlights illuminated the empty parking area. There were no other vehicles present, which was unusual even for this late hour. I pulled into a spot near the trailhead kiosk, leaving the engine running for warmth. The exhaust plume plumed visibly in the cold air. I put the truck in park and listened more closely to the scanner, The looped transmission continued, a few indistinct words followed by a burst of static, then the same words again. It was a male voice, strained, but the words themselves were unintelligible. I tried to hail dispatch but received no response. The radio was dead to outgoing calls, only receiving this one looping signal. My gaze drifted to the dashboard. The digital clock, usually a reliable timekeeper, caught my eye. It read a few minutes past 1 in the morning. As I watched, the numbers flickered. Not a normal flicker, but a jump. It skipped forward by several minutes, then settled. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light or my own fatigue. I looked again. The clock jumped once more, this time by a different increment, perhaps a minute or two. I stared intently, my breath fogging the air inside the cabin. The clock jumped again, a larger leap this time, almost 10 minutes. It was not a smooth progression, it was erratic, a series of small, irregular lurches forward. I checked my wristwatch. It showed the correct time, matching what the dash clock had displayed before its first jump. The truck's internal clock was clearly malfunctioning. I tried to reset it, pressing the small button on the dash. Nothing happened. The numbers continued their strange forward progression, each jump accompanied by a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the scanner's static. The looping call itself remained constant, but the background hum seemed to waver slightly with each time skip. The air in the cabin felt colder despite the running engine. I could see frost crystals forming on the inside of the windshield, a thin, delicate layer. I reached for my patrol notes, intending to log the scanner issue and the clock malfunction. My pen felt heavy in my hand. The silence outside the truck was absolute, broken only by the engine's idle and the persistent, garbled loop from the radio. The clock jumped again, a significant leap, pushing it almost an hour ahead of my wristwatch. I felt a growing unease. This was beyond a simple electrical fault. The jumps were too precise in their irregularity, too consistent in their forward direction. It was as if time itself was being nudged, not just the display. The valley remained quiet, the forest a dark, impenetrable wall around me. The headlights cast long, unmoving shadows. Nothing else seemed to be affected, yet the evidence on my dashboard was undeniable. The scanner continued its broken plea, a constant reminder of the anomaly. I decided to document everything. I pulled out my service camera and took a photograph of the dashboard clock, noting the time on my wristwatch and my logbook. I repeated this several times over the next few minutes, capturing the clock's erratic jumps. Each photograph showed a different, advanced time on the dash, while my watch remained steady. The frost on the windshield grew thicker, obscuring my view of the empty lot. I wiped a small patch clear, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing moving, no sign of life. The only light came from my truck's headlights and the faint glow of the dash. I knew the gap lot had a small, motion-activated CCTV camera mounted on the kiosk, primarily for security and monitoring trail usage. It recorded to a local drive with timestamps. I considered checking the footage later, hoping it might offer some corroboration or explanation. For now, I was stuck with the immediate, unsettling reality inside my truck. I tried the radio again, attempting to contact dispatch. Still nothing. The looping call was my only companion. A constant, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. The cold was seeping in, despite the heater running. I stepped out of the truck, leaving the engine idling and the headlights on. The air outside was sharp, biting. I walked slowly around the vehicle, checking the tires, the undercarriage, Everything appeared normal. The exhaust plume rose steadily into the frigid night. I walked over to the kiosk, shining my flashlight on the small camera lens. It was a standard model, nothing unusual. I looked at the trail register. The last entry was from earlier that afternoon, a group planning an overnight hike to a distant shelter. No one had signed out. Back in the truck, the dash clock had jumped even further ahead. It now showed a time that was nearly 2 hours past my actual time. The scanner's loop was still playing, a relentless, broken record. I felt a growing sense of isolation, a profound disconnect from the normal flow of time. The forest seemed to press in closer, its silence no longer comforting but oppressive. I considered driving away, but something held me there. The need to understand, to document this impossible event, was strong. I was a ranger. This was my responsibility. I spent another half hour in the lot, meticulously logging every jump of the clock, every nuance of the scanner's static. The frost on the windows became a solid sheet, requiring me to run the defroster on full blast. The looping call never stopped. It was always the same few words, always the same static burst. I could not make out the words, no matter how hard I tried. It was a whisper, a plea, lost in the noise. The truck's engine continued its steady hum, oblivious to the temporal anomaly unfolding within its cabin. I felt a strange sense of being watched, not by a person, but by the quiet, ancient forest itself. Eventually, the looping call on the scanner abruptly ceased. The static cleared, and the radio returned to its normal, silent state. At the same moment, the dash clock stopped jumping. It remained fixed at its advanced time, nearly 3 hours ahead of my actual time. I tried to reset it again, and this time, it responded. I set it back to the correct time, matching my wristwatch. The frost on the windows began to melt, dripping slowly. I drove back to the ranger station, the gravel crunching under my tires. I filed a detailed report, including my patrol notes and the photographs of the dashboard clock. I also requested that the CCTV footage from the Gap Lot kiosk be pulled and reviewed, specifically for the period I was present. The official explanation for the scanner issue was a localized atmospheric anomaly, common in mountainous terrain. The clock malfunction was attributed to an electrical surge, though no other systems in the truck were affected. My report was filed, and the incident was closed. I never heard anything further about the CCTV footage. No one else reported similar clock drift or looping radio calls. The truck was inspected, and no fault was found with its electrical system. I still patrol those same trails, and I still drive that same truck. Sometimes, late at night, when the forest is particularly quiet, I find myself glancing at the dashboard clock. I listen for the faint whisper of static on the scanner. The memory of that night remains, a quiet hum beneath the surface of my routine, a persistent, unsettling question. I was leading a hasty team on a search operation. It was late autumn, and the air on the Appalachian Ridge was barely above freezing. Our handheld radios, though showing full battery, were not passing carrier. We were operating on Dead Ridge, a remote section known for its challenging terrain and unpredictable weather. Our objective was to locate a solo hiker who had failed to check in at an AT shelter for 2 consecutive nights. The initial dispatch had been routine, a standard missing person protocol. My team was positioned on a high saddle, a natural choke point for communications, about 3 miles from the nearest trailhead. The repeater hut, a small, unassuming structure, sat a little higher up the ridge, a familiar landmark. It was our primary link to base, and the other search teams spread across the forest. The radio silence was immediate and absolute, a stark contrast to the usual chatter. We attempted to raise dispatch repeatedly, but received only dead air. The squelch click was the only sound our radios made, a hollow, mechanical confirmation of nothing. This was not a typical dead zone. Our equipment was robust, and the repeater was usually reliable. The cold wind carried a low, constant hum through the pines, adding to the growing sense of isolation. Our standard operating procedure for a missing hiker involved establishing a grid search, deploying multiple teams, and maintaining constant radio contact. We relied heavily on the repeater system to coordinate efforts across the expansive Appalachian terrain. The repeater, housed in its small cabin, was designed to boost our low-power handheld signals, allowing us to communicate over long distances and through dense forest. It was a critical piece of infrastructure, maintained by volunteers and checked regularly. The system usually worked flawlessly, providing clear, consistent communication. Our radio sheet detailed the frequencies, call signs, and emergency protocols. We had conducted numerous operations in this area, always with reliable communications. The night before, the weather had been clear, and all systems had reported normal. The forecast had called for a cold front, but nothing that should have impacted our equipment. This particular ridge saddle was usually a strong signal area, a place where even a low-power radio could reach the repeater without issue. The first real anomaly came when Team Bravo reported the same issue. They were positioned about 4 miles to our north, near a gap trailhead. Their handhelds showed full power, but they could not transmit or receive. Then came the report from Team Charlie, further south, near another AT shelter. Their radios were also silent. This was beyond a localized dead zone. I checked our repeater log, a small laminated card attached to my radio. It confirmed the repeater was on our primary frequency. I tried a direct line to base, bypassing the repeater, but still nothing. The silence was unnerving. It was not static. It was an absence of sound, a void where voices should have been. We were effectively cut off. I instructed my team to monitor the repeater channel, hoping for any sign of life. After a few minutes, a faint, almost imperceptible squelch break occurred. It was brief, a mere whisper of activity, then silence again. I checked my radio display. The signal strength indicator was full, showing a strong connection to the repeater, yet no audio came through. I keyed my microphone, waiting for the familiar tone that indicated a successful transmission. Nothing. My radio showed it was transmitting, but the repeater's input light, visible from our position on the saddle, remained dark. This was impossible. If my radio was transmitting, the repeater should have acknowledged it. I tried again, holding the key down for a full 10 seconds. Still, the repeater light did not flicker. Then, a new report came in from Team Bravo, relayed through a satellite phone they carried for emergencies. They reported seeing the repeater hut's LED blink. Not just any blink, but a consistent, rhythmic flash at exactly 12 seconds past the minute. Every minute. They confirmed this pattern over a period of about an hour. This was deeply unsettling. The repeater's LED should only blink when it receives an input signal or when it transmits. For it to blink at a precise, regular interval with no corresponding input from any of our teams was unprecedented. It suggested the repeater was active, but not in response to our transmissions. It was as if something else was keying it, something we could not hear. The cold air felt sharper now, carrying a new edge of unease. The wind hush seemed to take on a different quality, almost like a low, sustained hum. We were isolated, not just by distance, but by a communications breakdown that defied all logic. I ordered my team to maintain their positions and continue monitoring, while I made the decision to investigate the repeater hut directly. It was the only way to understand what was happening. The hike to the repeater hut was a little over a mile, a steep climb through dense forest. The trail was narrow, covered in a thin layer of frost that crunched under our boots. The fog had begun to roll in, obscuring the distant peaks and reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. The air grew colder, and the silence of the forest pressed in around us. We moved cautiously, our headlamps cutting through the swirling mist. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth seemed amplified. The isolation felt profound, a heavy blanket of quiet dread. As we approached the hut, its small, dark silhouette emerged from the fog. There were no headlights, no signs of human activity. The gravel path leading to the door. My radio showed it was transmitting, but the repeater's LED did not respond. It continued its own silent, 12-second pulse. I approached the door, a heavy steel plate secured with a padlock. It was intact, showing no signs of forced entry. I checked the small window, thick with condensation, but could see nothing inside. The hut felt cold, even from the outside. I pulled out the master key and unlocked the padlock. The door creaked open, revealing a small, cramped space filled with electronic equipment. The air inside was stale and cold. The repeater unit itself sat on a metal shelf, its various lights glowing steadily. And there it was, the red LED, blinking at its precise interval. I checked the internal logbook, a small spiral-bound notebook kept next to the repeater. The last entry was from a routine maintenance check about 3 weeks prior. There were no new entries, no notes about any anomalies. I examined the equipment carefully. All connections appeared secure. The power supply was stable. There was no visible damage, no loose wires. Nothing to explain the phantom keying or the radio blackout. It was as if the repeater was operating perfectly, but on its own terms, ignoring our presence entirely. The silence on our radios persisted. I tried to transmit again, standing right next to the repeater. My radio indicated transmission, but the repeater's input light remained dark. The red LED continued its solitary, rhythmic blink. It was a machine performing a function, but a function that had no logical source or destination. We were standing in the heart of the problem, and it offered no answers. The cold hum of the equipment, barely audible, seemed to mock our efforts. We spent about an hour at the hut, checking every possible variable. We confirmed the power source was stable, the antenna connections were tight, and the internal diagnostics showed no errors. Yet, the repeater continued its strange, silent operation. The other teams, still relying on satellite phones, reported the same radio silence. There was no explanation. We eventually had to withdraw from the ridge, leaving the repeater to its inexplicable rhythm. The missing hiker was eventually located by another team, far from Dead Ridge, having simply taken a wrong turn and gotten disoriented. They reported no unusual experiences, no strange radio signals. The official report noted a communications anomaly on Dead Ridge, citing an unexplained repeater malfunction. There was no evidence of tampering, no equipment failure. I was a ridge runner for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, performing my routine shelter checks. It was late winter, the air barely above freezing, and a fresh layer of powder snow covered everything. I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible disturbance near the shelter's entrance. My job involved patrolling specific sections of the Appalachian Trail, maintaining shelters, and ensuring the safety of hikers. This particular section was remote, a few days' hike from the nearest paved road, nestled deep in a ridge saddle. The shelter itself was a simple, three-sided structure with a tin roof, designed for basic overnight stays. I had arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the western peaks, casting long shadows across the forest. The cold was immediate and sharp, biting at any exposed skin. I had set up my small cabin cam, a standard practice for documenting shelter conditions and occasional wildlife. It was positioned low, aimed at the entrance and the small ladder leading to the sleeping loft. The camera recorded continuously, a silent witness to the isolation of the trail. I made a quick entry in the logbook, noting the fresh snow and the clear, cold conditions. The night promised to be still and quiet, typical for this time of year. My routine was precise and methodical. Each shelter check involved clearing debris, inspecting for damage, and updating the logbook. I always carried a portable radio, though reception was often spotty in these deep valleys. The hum of the radio was a constant, low background noise, a faint connection to the outside world. This particular evening, the static was more pronounced than usual, a subtle crackle that seemed to amplify the surrounding silence. I had prepared a simple meal, then settled into my sleeping bag, listening to the wind whisper through the pines. The temperature continued to drop steadily, making the inside of the shelter feel only marginally warmer than the outside. I drifted off, expecting an uneventful night. Just the usual sounds of the forest settling in for the cold. I woke suddenly, not to an alarm but to a distinct sound. It was a single, weighted ping, clear and metallic, coming from directly above me. The sound was unmistakable. Something had landed on the tin roof of the shelter. My eyes snapped open in the darkness. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound had been singular, not a series of steps, just one impact. I waited, straining to hear anything else, but the forest was silent once more, save for the faint, persistent static from my radio. My heart began to beat a little faster. I reached for my headlamp, its beam cutting through the inky blackness. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, the nylon rustling loudly in the quiet. I moved cautiously towards the shelter entrance, peering out into the night. The moonlight was dim, filtered through a thin layer of high cloud, but enough to illuminate the fresh powder snow. The surface was pristine, a smooth, unbroken blanket covering the ground around the shelter. There were no tracks, no indentations, nothing to suggest anything had approached or departed. I scanned the area carefully, my headlamp beam sweeping across the snow, then up towards the roofline. The roof itself was a dark, flat expanse, also covered in the same undisturbed layer of powder. I could see no sign of anything having landed there. The metallic ping had been too distinct to be mistaken for a branch falling or snow shifting. It had sounded like a deliberate, heavy placement. I stood there for a few minutes, the cold seeping into my boots, the air sharp in my lungs. The isolation of the place felt suddenly amplified, the silence no longer peaceful, but unnerving. I returned inside, my mind racing, trying to rationalize the sound. I checked the cabin cam, ensuring it was still recording. The small red light blinked steadily. I spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened awareness, listening to every creak of the wood, every rustle of the leaves. But the sound did not repeat. The first hint of dawn brought a pale, gray light to the forest. I was up immediately, eager to investigate in better visibility. The cold was still intense, and my breath plumed in the air. I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the frozen snow. I circled the shelter slowly, examining the snow surface with meticulous care. The powder remained glass smooth, unbroken by any footprint or drag mark. I looked up at the roof again. From this angle, I could see the full expanse of the tin, still covered in its undisturbed layer of fresh snow. There was no impression, no displaced powder. Nothing to indicate that anything had touched it. The contradiction was stark and immediate. I had heard a distinct impact, yet there was no physical evidence of it. I retrieved the small ladder I kept for maintenance and carefully placed it against the side of the shelter. I ascended slowly, my gloved hand gripping the rungs. As I neared the top, I paused, looking directly at the roof. The snow was perfectly smooth, a uniform white blanket. I reached out a hand, brushing a small section of the powder. It was light and fluffy, easily disturbed. If something had landed there, even lightly, it would have left a mark. I descended the ladder, feeling a growing sense of unease. The lack of evidence was more unsettling than finding something tangible. I then remembered the cabin cam. It had been recording all night. I retrieved the camera, eager to review the footage. Back inside the shelter, I connected the camera to my small portable viewer. I fast-forwarded through the early hours of the night, watching the static image of the shelter entrance. Around what I estimated to be a little past midnight, the time I had woken, I heard it again. The same distinct, weighted ping, metallic and clear. It was captured by the camera's microphone. The visual feed, however, showed nothing. The entrance remained empty, the snow outside undisturbed. I continued to watch, frame by frame, for several minutes after the sound. Then, a subtle detail caught my eye. A dark shape, indistinct but clearly a gloved hand, briefly entered the very bottom of the frame. It appeared to brush against the lowest rung of the ladder, then vanished. The movement was quick, almost a flicker, lasting less than a second. It was not a full person, just that fleeting glimpse of a hand. I replayed that section repeatedly, trying to make sense of it. The hand was clearly visible, wearing a dark glove, moving with purpose. Yet, no one had appeared in the entrance, and no tracks were visible in the snow outside. The ladder was positioned just to the left of the camera's view, slightly out of the main frame. The hand had appeared from the direction of the ladder, brushed a rung, and then disappeared. This meant someone had been there, at the shelter, at the exact moment the sound occurred. But if someone had been on the ladder, they would have had to approach the shelter, leaving tracks in the snow. And if they were on the ladder, why would they be on the roof? And why would there be no tracks there either? The procedural mind struggled with the contradiction. I spent the next few hours meticulously documenting everything. I took numerous photographs of the undisturbed snow, both on the ground and on the roof. I noted the exact time of the sound on the camera footage. I made detailed entries in my logbook, describing the metallic ping, the lack of physical tracks, and the brief appearance of the gloved hand on the camera feed. My radio reception remained poor, but I managed to get a weak signal to dispatch. I reported the unusual incident, emphasizing the lack of explanation. They advised me to remain vigilant and to continue my patrol as planned, but to file a full report upon my return. The isolation of the trail felt heavier now, the forest no longer just quiet, but watchful. Upon my return to the ranger station, I submitted my full report, including the camera footage and the photographs. The authorities reviewed the evidence. They confirmed the distinct sound on the audio and the visual of the gloved hand. They also confirmed the complete absence of tracks in the snow, both approaching the shelter and on the roof itself. There was no logical explanation for the sequence of events. No one had been reported missing in the area. No other hikers had signed the logbook for days before or after my stay. The incident was filed as an unexplained occurrence. It remained an open question, a data point without a solution. The official file on the incident remains open, a procedural anomaly. I still perform my duties on the trail, checking shelters and maintaining the paths. But sometimes, especially on cold, still nights, I hear that single, weighted ping. It echoes in my memory, a sound without a source, a presence without a trace. I was on my routine night patrol, checking the Appalachian Trail shelters. It was late autumn, the air crisp, and carrying the scent of damp leaves. That night, a single, distant light appeared where no light should have been. My job involved monitoring a specific section of the Appalachian Trail, primarily after dark. I would drive the access roads, hike short spurs to check on shelters, and ensure everything was secure. The routine was familiar, almost meditative, especially in the quiet of the forest. I carried a printed map, a powerful headlamp, and a handheld radio for dispatch contact. My vehicle was a sturdy four-wheel drive, often parked at remote trailheads. The isolation was usually the most notable aspect of these shifts. On this particular night, the temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, leaving a thin layer of frost on the higher elevations. A light fog had begun to settle into the hollows, obscuring the distant ridges. I had just finished checking the Birch Gap shelter, signing the logbook, and was making my way back to the vehicle. The access road was mostly gravel, winding down a steep grade. From my vantage point on the ridge, I had a clear, if distant, view of a section of the old reroute below. This reroute had been officially closed for years, overgrown and removed from current maps. It was marked with faded orange blazes, barely visible even in daylight. I was about to get into my truck when I noticed the light. It was a focused beam, like a headlamp, moving steadily uphill on the old reroute. My first thought was a lost hiker, though it was an unusual path to take. The light was faint, but distinct against the dark backdrop of the forest. It moved with a deliberate, slow pace, ascending the steep incline. I pulled out my binoculars, steadying them against the roof of my vehicle. Through the lenses, the light resolved into a clear, bright point. It was indeed a headlamp, moving against the grade. There was no sound, only the hum of the forest and the distant whisper of the wind through the pines. I watched for a few minutes, trying to make sense of it. The reroute was known for its dense laurel thickets, especially near the higher elevations where it rejoined the main trail. It was not a path anyone would choose, even by accident, especially at night. The trail was barely discernible in places, choked with fallen timber and thorny undergrowth. I checked my printed map again, confirming the reroute status. It was clearly marked as closed, with no connecting spurs or side trails that would lead a hiker onto it from the main AT. The nearest official trailhead was miles away, and the main trail itself was on the opposite side of the ridge. The light continued its slow, steady ascent. It did not waver or sweep from side to side as a person searching for a path might. It held a fixed beam, pointed forward and slightly upward. I considered calling dispatch, but I had no immediate emergency to report. A single light on a closed trail, while unusual, did not automatically warrant a full response. I decided to observe further. The air grew colder, and I could feel the chill seeping into the cabin of my truck. I kept the binoculars fixed on the light, my breath misting in the cold air. The isolation of the moment was profound. As the light climbed higher, it approached a particularly dense section of laurel. This part of the reroute was notorious for its impenetrable growth, forming a natural wall on either side of the narrow path. I had hiked that section once during daylight, years ago, and remembered the feeling of being swallowed by the vegetation. The light reached the edge of this thicket. It continued to move, slowly, steadily, into the dense green. I expected it to pause, perhaps to navigate the difficult terrain, or for the beam to reflect off the leaves. Instead, it simply entered the laurel. And then it was gone. One moment the bright point was there, pushing into the dark mass of leaves. The next it was not. There was no flicker, no dimming, no sudden drop or sweep. It simply ceased to be visible. I kept the binoculars trained on the spot, waiting. I waited for a minute, then 2, then 5. The night remained dark and silent. The fog seemed to thicken slightly in the hollows below. I scanned the area around where the light had vanished, moving the binoculars slowly, methodically. Nothing. The laurel thicket remained a solid, dark mass. There was no sign of the headlamp, no hint of its presence. I lowered the binoculars, my hands feeling stiff from the cold. The absence of the light was more unsettling than its presence had been. A hiker would have stopped, or turned, or their light would have been obscured gradually. This was an abrupt, complete disappearance. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the person had turned off their headlamp. But why in the middle of a dense, dark thicket on a closed trail? Perhaps they had fallen. But there was no sound, no indication of a struggle. The silence was absolute. I picked up my radio, the static a familiar sound in the quiet. I hailed dispatch, reporting an unusual observation. I described the location of the closed reroute, the time I had observed the light, and its sudden disappearance. The dispatcher, a calm voice named Sarah, acknowledged my report. She asked if I had seen any vehicle parked nearby, or any other signs of activity. I confirmed there were none. My own headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the gravel road around my truck. I felt a prickle of unease, a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sarah advised me to remain at my current position and continue observing. She would check the patrol log for any scheduled maintenance or known activity in that sector, though it was highly unlikely on a closed reroute. I kept my binoculars ready, scanning the dark forest. The fog was now a tangible presence, drifting slowly through the trees. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, but nothing else. After about 15 minutes, Sarah radioed back. There were no records of anyone authorized to be on that reroute. nor any reports of overdue hikers in the general area. She suggested I drive down to the base of the reroute and conduct a visual sweep with my vehicle's headlights, but not to approach on foot. I started my truck and slowly drove down the winding gravel road. The headlights cut wide arcs through the fog, illuminating the trees and the occasional rockfall. When I reached the approximate base of the old reroute, I stopped. I angled my vehicle so the powerful headlights shone directly up the steep incline where the reroute began. The beam penetrated the initial growth, revealing the faint outline of the old path. I could see the faded orange blazes on the trees, barely visible beneath layers of moss and lichen. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. There were no fresh tracks, no disturbed earth, no sign that anyone had recently walked there. I used my binoculars again, sweeping the beam of my headlights up the reroute. The light was strong enough to penetrate a good distance, but it eventually faded into the dense forest canopy. I focused on the section where the headlamp had vanished, the thick laurel. Even with my powerful headlights, it looked like an impenetrable wall of vegetation. There was no break, no opening, no sign of anything having passed through. The forest was still, save for the distant hum of my truck engine. I spent another half hour conducting this visual search, moving my vehicle a few times to get different angles. Each time, the result was the same: nothing. I reported my findings to dispatch. Sarah logged the incident as an unexplained observation. She said a park ranger team would conduct a daylight sweep of the area the following morning, focusing on the reroute and the surrounding terrain. I was instructed to complete my patrol as usual, but to remain vigilant. The rest of my shift passed without further incident, but the image of that single ascending light and its sudden, silent disappearance stayed with me. The cold seemed to linger in my bones. The next day, I followed up with the ranger station. The team had found nothing: no tracks, no discarded gear, no sign of passage on the reroute. The laurel thicket was as dense as I remembered, completely undisturbed. The official report noted the observation, but without any corroborating evidence, it remained an open file. It was logged as an isolated incident, a strange occurrence with no clear explanation. The logbook entry from my patrol that night simply stated, "Unusual light observed on closed reroute, no further contact." I still patrol that section of the trail. Sometimes, on a clear, cold night, when the fog begins to settle in the hollows, I find myself looking towards that old reroute. I listen for any distant crunch of footsteps on the gravel, or the faint whisper of movement in the forest. The memory of that single ascending light and its silent vanishing act remains vivid. I am a trail maintainer, responsible for a section of the Appalachian Trail in northern Georgia. It was late autumn, the air carrying a sharp chill that promised early frost. I was checking the shelter register, a routine task that sometimes revealed small irregularities. My duties involve regular patrols of a specific trail segment, ensuring its integrity and the safety of hikers. This includes clearing fallen trees, marking faded blazes, and maintaining the shelters. Each shelter contains a register, a simple spiral-bound logbook where hikers record their names, dates, and sometimes a brief message. These registers serve as a vital, if informal, record of who passes through. They can also be crucial in locating a missing person. The shelter I was visiting that day was nestled in a deep hollow, accessible by a narrow, winding gravel road that branched off a less-traveled highway. The forest canopy was thick, even with many leaves fallen. creating a perpetual dimness that felt more pronounced as the days grew shorter. I had driven my truck as far as the trailhead, then hiked the remaining distance, the cold air biting at my exposed skin. The previous day, a hiker named River had been evacuated from a point about 3 ridge saddles north of my section. The report came through my radio, a burst of static and clipped words from dispatch. River had suffered a severe ankle injury, requiring a helicopter lift. The incident had occurred well into the evening, a little past sundown, making the extraction difficult and time-consuming. I had noted the details in my own log, a standard procedure for any significant event on the trail. My job was to be aware of all such incidents, even those outside my immediate patrol area, as they could impact trail conditions or hiker flow. The shelter register was usually a straightforward document, filled with a mix of neat and hurried handwriting, sometimes accompanied by small drawings or trail names. It was a tangible link to the transient community of the trail, a quiet hum of human presence in the vast isolation of the forest. I arrived at the shelter just before the sun began its descent, casting long, pale shadows through the trees. The air was still, the only sound the rustle of dry leaves under my boots. Inside the rustic cabin, the air was cold and damp. I lit my small lantern, its soft hiss illuminating the rough-hewn walls and the sturdy wooden table where the register lay. I opened the logbook to the most recent entries, expecting to see the usual collection of names from the past day or two. My eyes scanned the page, looking for any notes about trail conditions or maintenance needs. I quickly located the entry for River, dated 2 days prior. It was a clear, concise entry, typical of a seasoned hiker. A trail name, a date, and a brief note about heading north. I remembered the evacuation report clearly. River had been lifted out of the wilderness late the previous night, transported to a medical facility in a county far to the north. There was no way River could have been back on the trail, let alone at this shelter, since the evacuation. I continued to turn the pages, reviewing the entries. Then I stopped. Directly beneath River's original entry, dated 2 days ago, were 2 new lines. They were written in what appeared to be the same hand, with the same distinctive slant and pressure. The ink, however, seemed slightly different, a shade darker perhaps. The first new line simply read, "Still here." The second line, directly below it, was dated yesterday, the day of the evacuation. It read, "Waiting." My breath hitched, a small, involuntary reaction. The lantern cast a steady glow, but the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to deepen. I leaned closer, examining the entries with a growing sense of unease. The original entry was clearly 2 days old. The new lines were dated yesterday. This was impossible. River had been airlifted out of the forest, miles away, hours before these new entries could have been made. I ran my finger over the paper, feeling the slight indentation of the pen. The ink on the new lines felt fresh, not entirely dry to the touch, unlike the older entries which had fully absorbed into the paper fibers. The handwriting was identical, a distinctive, almost elegant script. There was no doubt it was the same person who had written the initial entry. I checked the surrounding entries, looking for any other anomalies. All the other names and dates seemed to follow a logical progression. Hikers moving through the area as expected. The cold in the cabin seemed to intensify, a subtle shift that prickled my skin. I pulled out my phone, its screen a stark contrast to the dim light of the lantern. I took several photographs of the page, focusing on River's entries. The digital images captured the subtle differences in ink color and texture, confirming my initial observation. The implications were unsettling. Someone had added to this register, claiming to be River, after River had already been removed from the trail. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps another hiker, a friend of River's, had made the entries as a joke, or a misguided attempt at a message. But the handwriting was too precise, too identical. And the tone of the new entries, still here and waiting, carried a quiet, almost desperate resonance that felt far from a prank. It suggested a presence, a lingering. I checked the surrounding area of the shelter, walking a slow perimeter. The forest was silent, save for the distant whisper of the wind through the pines. There were no fresh footprints around the cabin, no signs of recent activity beyond my own. The ground was firm, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves and a light dusting of frost from the previous night. I walked the short path to the water source, a small spring, and found nothing out of place. The isolation of the place pressed in on me, a heavy, palpable presence. I returned to the shelter, my mind racing through possibilities. The radio, usually a source of comfort, felt like a dead weight in my pack. I knew I had to report this. It was beyond a simple trail anomaly. It touched on the official report of an evacuation, a documented event. I pulled out my radio, the familiar weight in my hand. I pressed the transmit button, the static crackling to life before I spoke. I relayed the details to my supervisor, keeping my voice even, factual. I described the original entry, the evacuation report, and then the new lines in the register. There was a pause on the other end, a moment of silence that stretched. My supervisor, a man named Frank, was usually unflappable. His voice, when it came, was measured, but I detected a slight edge of concern. He asked me to confirm the details, specifically the date of the new entry and the exact wording. I repeated them precisely. Frank instructed me to secure the register, to treat it as evidence. He said he would contact local law enforcement and dispatch a ranger to my location. The ranger would arrive by morning, he estimated, as the light would be fading soon. I was to remain at the shelter to ensure no one else tampered with the logbook. The thought of spending the night alone in that cabin, with those entries staring up from the page, was not a welcome one. I secured the register in a waterproof bag, placing it inside my pack. I then spent the rest of the evening preparing for the night, building a small fire in the shelter's pit, the smoke curling up into the cold air. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig, seemed amplified in the growing darkness. I kept my lantern lit, its soft hum a small comfort against the encroaching night. I found myself replaying the details of the evacuation report, the precise time River was lifted out, the location. There was no logical explanation for the new entries. The ranger arrived just after sunrise, his headlights cutting through the morning fog as he drove up the gravel road to the trailhead. He was a young man, serious and methodical. I explained everything again, showing him the photographs I had taken. He examined the register carefully, his brow furrowed. He agreed that the handwriting was identical, and the ink on the new entries did appear fresher. He took his own set of photographs using specialized equipment. He then carefully bagged the register, sealing it for transport. The ranger made a few calls on his radio, speaking in low tones. He confirmed that the official report of River's evacuation was solid, with multiple witnesses and medical personnel involved. There was no possibility of River having returned to the trail. The incident was officially filed as an unexplained anomaly. The register was sent to a forensic lab for analysis. The report, which came back a few weeks later, confirmed that the ink on the two new lines was indeed different from the original entry, though the composition was similar. It also stated that the new entries were made within a day of the evacuation. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive, only stating that the similarities were striking, but could not definitively prove or disprove that the same hand had written all entries. There was no further investigation. The case was closed, filed away in a folder marked unresolved. I still patrol that section of the trail. I still check the register at that shelter. Each time I open a new logbook, I feel a faint, almost imperceptible shiver. The forest holds its secrets close, and sometimes, it seems, it allows them to whisper. I was on a routine search and rescue patrol, part of a two-person team. It was late autumn, well past midnight, and the air was barely above freezing. We were checking a remote section of the Appalachian Trail when the first anomaly appeared. My partner, Mark, was ahead of me, his headlamp beam cutting through the dense fog that had settled in the hollows. We were moving slowly, scanning the trail for any sign of a missing hiker, reported earlier that evening. The report was vague, a simple check-in missed at an AT shelter a few miles north of our position. The forest was silent, a heavy, damp quiet that often precedes a hard frost. Our boots crunched softly on the gravel path, the only sound for what felt like miles. We approached a small creek crossing, marked by a simple wooden footbridge. The bridge spanned a narrow, dark channel of water that flowed sluggishly beneath us. As I stepped onto the bridge, my headlamp caught something unusual on the wooden handrail. A thin layer of frost was forming and then clearing, not randomly, but in a steady, rhythmic pulse. It was unlike anything I had ever observed in the backcountry. The micro ice crystals would materialize, shimmer for a moment, and then vanish, only to reappear a few seconds later. The pattern was distinct, almost deliberate. Our work in search and rescue often involved these late-night calls. The Appalachian Trail, especially in these more isolated sections, could be unforgiving. Hikers sometimes underestimated the rapid changes in weather or the sheer physical demands. We were accustomed to navigating by headlamp, to the cold, and to the profound isolation of the forest at night. Our gear was always meticulously checked. Radios, GPS units, first aid kits, and thermal viewers. We had trained for every conceivable scenario, from minor injuries to full-scale multi-day searches. The procedural aspects of our job were ingrained. We followed protocols, documented everything, and relied on our experience to interpret the subtle signs of the wilderness. This particular section of trail was known for its dense tree cover and occasional radio blackouts, making communication with dispatch challenging at times. We had passed several gap trailheads earlier, each one a potential entry or exit point for a hiker. The logbook at the last shelter had shown no recent entries for the missing individual, which was concerning. The air was still, the kind of stillness that absorbs all sound, leaving only the hum of your own blood in your ears. The creek below the bridge was almost entirely black, reflecting no light, its surface undisturbed by any breeze. I stopped on the footbridge, my attention fixed on the handrail. Mark, a few paces ahead, turned back when he realized I wasn't following. He saw my headlamp beam focused on the wood. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a low murmur in the quiet. I didn't answer immediately, just pointed. He moved closer, his own light joining mine on the rail. The rhythmic frost continued its strange cycle. It was a delicate, almost invisible layer, but distinct enough to catch the light. Each pulse lasted for perhaps 2 or 3 seconds. The frost would bloom across the surface of the seasoned wood, a fine white tracery, then recede completely, leaving the dark, damp grain exposed. Then it would begin again. The temperature was barely above freezing, perhaps a degree or 2 Celsius, but certainly not cold enough for such rapid, localized frost formation and dissipation. We both stood there for a few minutes, watching the phenomenon in silence. The only sound was the faint hush of the creek water moving beneath us, a sound that seemed to be swallowed by the surrounding forest. There was no wind, not even a whisper of air movement to explain the clearing of the frost. The air felt heavy, stagnant. I reached for my thermal viewer, a standard piece of equipment for locating heat signatures. I aimed it at the handrail. The screen showed a fluctuating temperature reading. Where the frost appeared, the temperature would dip by a few degrees, then rise back to ambient as it cleared. The fluctuations were perfectly synchronized with the visible pulses. This was not a natural process. Natural frost forms slowly, steadily, and dissipates with rising temperatures or direct sunlight. This was an active, repeated cooling and warming, confined to a small section of the wooden rail. I took out my DSLR camera, fitted with a macro lens, and began taking a series of photographs. I wanted to document every detail, every phase of the cycle. The camera's shutter click was surprisingly loud in the profound quiet. Mark moved to the edge of the bridge, peering down into the black water of the creek. "It's completely still down there," he observed, his voice hushed. No current, no ripples, just black. The water looked unnaturally dark, like a void. The banks were overgrown, dense with shadow. The rhythmic pulsing continued, unwavering. It felt like something was drawing breath, a slow, steady respiration, right there on the bridge. The cold emanating from the rail was subtle, but I could feel it when I held my hand close. It was a damp, penetrating cold, distinct from the ambient air. We tried to rationalize it. Perhaps some unusual microclimate, a specific humidity level, or a strange interaction with the wood itself. But none of our explanations fit the rhythmic, almost mechanical nature of the event. It was too precise, too regular. The isolation of the location amplified the strangeness. We were miles from any highway, deep in the forest, with no other lights or sounds to distract us. The fog seemed to press in closer, making the world beyond our headlamps an impenetrable wall of gray. The hum of our radio, usually a comforting presence, was absent. We were in a dead zone, a complete radio blackout. This added another layer of unease to the situation. We were on our own, observing something inexplicable in the deep night. The frost pulses continued, steady and relentless. A silent, cold breath in the wilderness. We decided to investigate further, following our established protocols for unusual findings. Mark checked the area around the bridge, looking for any tracks or disturbances on the trail leading up to it. I continued to document the frost, taking more photographs and making detailed field notes. I described the exact location, the ambient conditions, and the precise timing of the pulses. The thermal viewer remained focused on the rail, recording the temperature fluctuations. We tried our radio again, hoping to get through to dispatch, but only static filled the air. The silence that followed the static was even more profound. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, listening. Mark returned, shaking his head. "Nothing," he reported. "No fresh prints, no broken branches, nothing out of place on either side of the creek." He looked back at the bridge, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "This isn't right," he said, stating the obvious. We considered the possibility of a prank, but the remote location and the complexity of creating such a precise, sustained effect made it highly improbable. No one would go to such lengths in the middle of nowhere, especially not in these conditions. We spent another hour at the site. The rhythmic frost never wavered. It continued its slow, steady cycle, an unsettling presence in the cold night. We walked the length of the footbridge several times, examining the wood, the supports, and the ground beneath. There was no visible source for the localized cooling. No wires, no hidden devices, nothing. The creek remained black and still, its surface like polished obsidian. The air grew colder as the night progressed, but the frost on the rail continued its independent rhythm, unaffected by the broader temperature drop. Our primary objective was still the missing hiker. We knew we couldn't stay at the bridge indefinitely. We had to continue our search pattern. Before leaving, I took one last series of photographs, trying to capture the subtle interplay of light and ice. The images, I knew, would barely convey the unsettling nature of the live observation. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, a different kind of cold than the usual autumn chill. It felt like a cold that came from within the earth, or from something unseen. We continued along the trail, our headlamps pushing back the fog. But the image of the pulsing frost stayed with me. Every few minutes, I would glance back, half expecting to see it still there, breathing in the darkness. The forest felt different now, imbued with a new, quiet dread. The isolation felt heavier, more oppressive. We moved faster than before, a silent agreement passing between us to put some distance between ourselves and that footbridge. We eventually located the missing hiker a few miles further along the trail, huddled in a small abandoned cabin, disoriented but otherwise unharmed. He had simply lost his way and taken shelter, missing his check-in. We guided him back to the nearest trailhead and handed him over to the waiting authorities. Our official report included a detailed account of the footbridge incident. We submitted the field notes, the thermal viewer data, and the photographs. The report was filed, categorized as an unexplained environmental anomaly. There was no follow-up investigation, no official explanation. The photographs, when viewed later, showed only faint traces of frost, easily dismissed as condensation or lens flare by those who hadn't been there. The thermal data was more compelling, showing clear, rhythmic temperature drops. But without a clear cause, it remained an outlier in the file. The logbook entry was concise, factual, and devoid of speculation, as per our training. The incident was closed, but it never truly left my mind. I still think about that footbridge sometimes, especially on cold, still nights. The image of the frost forming and clearing, like a slow, deliberate breath, is etched into my memory. The profound silence of the creek, the heavy fog, the complete radio blackout. It all combined to create something truly unnerving. I have never encountered anything like it since. The memory of that cold, rhythmic pulse in the deep forest remains, a quiet whisper from the wilderness. I was a volunteer trail maintainer for a section of the Appalachian Trail. It was late autumn, just before the first heavy snow, and the air held a sharp chill. My routine patrol that evening began with an unexpected reroute notice. The notice had been stapled to a kiosk at a less-traveled junction, one that hikers often missed if they were not paying close attention to their paper maps. My job involved checking these kiosks, ensuring trail markers were clear, and logging any unusual observations. This particular reroute was recent, directing southbound hikers around a washed-out bridge about 3 miles ahead. The sun had already dipped below the ridge, casting long, deep shadows across the forest floor. A thin fog was beginning to settle in the lower elevations, promising a cold night. My routine patrols usually involved a quiet hike, checking for fallen trees, damaged blazes, and any signs of human activity that might violate trail regulations. I carried a small pack with basic tools, a first aid kit, and my radio for dispatch contact. The trail was often empty this time of year, with most through hikers having completed their journeys. The isolation was usually a comfort, a predictable solitude. I had walked this section countless times, knowing every root and rock. The air was still, the kind of stillness that precedes a hard frost. There was no wind to speak of, just the faint hum of distant highway traffic, barely audible through the dense forest. I reached the reroute junction just as the last light faded from the sky. The kiosk stood a little off the main path, a simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, designed to protect notices from the elements. I pulled out my headlamp, its beam cutting a sharp circle through the gathering gloom. The new reroute notice was prominently displayed, a standard printout on heavy paper, secured with 4 staples. I took out my phone to photograph it for my records, a procedural step to document its placement and condition. As I raised the phone, focusing on the notice, I heard it. It was a distinct sound, a sharp, singular click. The sound seemed to come directly from the kiosk, specifically from the notice itself. It was not a rustle of paper in the wind, because there was no wind. The air was completely still, cold and heavy. The sound was metallic, like a small counter being pressed, or a single staple shifting under pressure. I lowered my phone, my headlamp beam still fixed on the notice. Nothing moved. The paper remained flat against the wooden board. I waited, listening intently. The forest was silent, save for the distant, almost imperceptible hum. I moved closer, examining the notice. The paper was thick, almost cardstock, and it was stapled securely at each corner. I ran my gloved finger along the edge of the paper, feeling the slight resistance of the staples. Everything felt firm, undisturbed. I checked the other notices on the kiosk, older ones detailing trail etiquette and local wildlife. They were all still, brittle with age. The click had been so precise, so localized. It had felt like something internal to the paper, or the staple itself. I took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in my lungs. My mind searched for a rational explanation. Perhaps a small insect or a piece of debris settling. But the sound had been too mechanical, too deliberate. I took the photograph, then decided to record a short audio note on my phone describing the incident. My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet. I spoke about the stillness, the lack of wind, and the distinct click. I mentioned the exact location, the reroute junction, and the specific notice. As I finished the recording, I felt a subtle shift in the air, a drop in temperature that seemed to penetrate my layers. The fog had thickened, now swirling around the base of the kiosk. The isolation of the spot felt more pronounced, less comforting. I decided to check the reroute path itself, just a short distance in, to ensure it was clearly marked. The path was narrow, winding through dense undergrowth. The trees pressed in close, their branches heavy with the damp air. My headlamp beam struggled to cut through the increasing fog. I walked for about 10 minutes, confirming the initial blazes were visible, then turned back towards the kiosk. The return trip felt different. The silence was deeper, more absolute. The distant highway hum had vanished, swallowed by the fog. Back at the kiosk, I paused. The notice was still there, unchanged. I looked around the junction, sweeping my headlamp beam across the gravel path and into the surrounding forest. There were no footprints other than my own, no signs of recent passage. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. I tried my radio, a standard procedure for checking in with dispatch after completing a section. All I received was static. The radio was usually reliable in this area, but the fog often interfered with the signal. It was a common occurrence, but tonight it added to the sense of unease. I made my way back to my vehicle, parked about a mile down a narrow access road. The walk felt longer than usual. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, made me pause. The fog was now so dense that my headlamp created a halo, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I kept my hand on the radio, occasionally pressing the transmit button, hoping for a break in the static. Nothing. Just the hiss and crackle of an empty channel. The cold seeped into my bones. When I finally reached my truck, the headlights cut through the thick fog, illuminating the gravel road. I started the engine, letting the hum of the heater slowly warm the cabin. I tried the radio again, and this time, after a few moments of static, I heard a faint voice. I reported the reroute notice, its condition, and the radio blackout I had experienced. I hesitated before mentioning the click. It felt too strange, too unsubstantiated. I simply noted an unusual sound at the kiosk, attributing it to possible settling of the structure or the paper. Dispatch acknowledged my report, their voice slightly muffled. I drove slowly out of the access road and onto the highway, the fog still clinging to the trees. Back at the ranger station, I filed my patrol report, detailing the reroute and the radio issues. I uploaded the photograph of the notice and the audio note I had recorded. In the official logbook, I made a brief entry about the unexplained sound at the kiosk, noting the absence of wind. My supervisor reviewed the report the next morning. He found nothing unusual in it, attributing the sound to environmental factors or my imagination in the quiet night. The incident was closed, filed away. There was no evidence of anything amiss. No missing hikers reported in that section. No further strange occurrences at the reroute junction. The reroute itself was eventually removed once the bridge was repaired. Yet the memory of that precise, metallic click remained. It was a sound that defied explanation. A single, sharp anomaly in an otherwise predictable environment. I still patrol that section of the trail sometimes. I always check that kiosk, even when there are no new notices. The wood is weathered, the staples are rusted, but the structure stands firm. The air is often still there, just as it was that night. And sometimes, in the deep quiet of the forest, I can almost hear it again. That single, unsettling click. I was a dispatcher for a small county service, working the overnight shift. The air outside the cabin was barely above freezing. A typical late autumn night in the Appalachians. A faint, unusual static began to hum on one of my inactive radio channels. My routine was usually predictable. A rhythm of quiet observation and occasional urgent response. I monitored several frequencies, mostly for trail emergencies or minor highway incidents. The dispatch cabin was a small, functional space, insulated against the cold, its windows looking out onto a dark stretch of forest. The only constant sounds were the low hum of the equipment and the distant, almost imperceptible whisper of the wind through the pines. I often spent these hours reviewing old logbook entries, or simply watching the frost creep across the glass. The isolation was a familiar companion, a part of the job I had grown accustomed to over the years. This particular night had started like many others, with the steady glow of the console lights and the comforting weight of the radio headset. The static on the retired frequency was not loud, just a persistent, low-level hiss that cut through the usual background hum. It was a channel that had been decommissioned years ago, reserved for specific, rare interagency communications that almost never occurred. I checked the console, confirming the frequency display. There was no reason for it to be active, much less generating static. I tried to clear it, cycling the channel, but the hiss remained. It was a minor anomaly, something I would normally note in the shift log and then forget. But then, a voice broke through the static. It was a garbled, distorted sound, barely intelligible at first. I adjusted the squelch, leaning closer to the speaker. The voice repeated, clearer this time, though still heavily filtered by interference. It was a distress call, a mayday. The words were simple, a plea for help, stating a general location somewhere along the Appalachian Trail, near one of the more remote gap trailheads. The message itself was not unusual for the region, but the frequency was. I immediately tried to respond, keying my mic, but received no reply. The voice continued its plea, a loop of the same few sentences. I began to record the transmission on the official dispatch recorder, as per protocol. The voice was male, strained, and sounded young. I also pulled out my personal phone, a habit I had developed for capturing unusual atmospheric phenomena or strange radio signals that might later be dismissed as equipment error. I held the phone near the speaker, recording the same audio feed. The mayday repeated, a continuous loop of the same message, the same words, the same plea. As I listened, A subtle shift registered in my perception. The voice, while repeating the identical message, seemed to possess a slightly different timbre each time it cycled. It was not a change in the words, but in the underlying vocal quality. A subtle variation in pitch, a different resonance. One loop sounded slightly deeper, the next a fraction higher. I dismissed it initially as a trick of the static, or perhaps a fault in the old frequency. I made a note in the logbook, detailing the time and the unusual nature of the transmission. The cold outside seemed to press closer against the cabin walls. The Mayday continued its loop for about an hour. I tried to triangulate the signal, but the old frequency offered limited data. The general area indicated was a known reroute section of the trail, a place where hikers sometimes got disoriented, especially at night. It was a remote area, several miles from the nearest paved highway, accessible primarily by a gravel turnout at the gap. The fog had begun to roll in, thick and heavy, obscuring the distant ridge saddles. I knew the trail well, having hiked portions of it myself. The thought of someone out there, lost in the cold and fog, was unsettling. After a while, the looped call faded, replaced by the persistent, low static. I reviewed the two recordings I had made, the official dispatch recording and the one from my personal phone. I played them back, side by side, on two separate devices. The discrepancy was immediately apparent. Both recordings contained the identical message, word for word. Yet, the voice on my personal phone sounded distinctly different from the voice on the official recorder. One was slightly rougher, the other smoother. It was not a dramatic difference, but it was undeniable, like two different individuals reading the same script. This was beyond atmospheric interference. I decided to investigate. It was a deviation from standard procedure, but the unusual nature of the incident compelled me. I grabbed my portable scanner, a more sensitive device than the cabin's fixed unit, and my two phones. I drove my vehicle out to the Gap trailhead, the location indicated by the faint signal. The drive took about 40 minutes, the headlights cutting through the dense fog that now blanketed the highway. The gravel road leading to the turnout was slick with moisture. The air was sharp, biting at my exposed skin as I stepped out of the vehicle. The turnout was empty, just a small, unpaved lot surrounded by dense forest. The trail marker was barely visible through the fog. I set up the portable scanner on the hood of my vehicle, its antenna extended into the cold night air. I placed both phones next to it, their recording functions active. The exhaust idled softly, a low hum in the profound silence of the forest. I tuned the scanner to the retired frequency. The static was present, a familiar hiss. After a few minutes, the Mayday began again. It was fainter here, but undeniably present. I could hear it through the scanner's speaker. I watched the recording indicators on both phones. They were capturing the same audio feed, side by side, from the same source. I listened intently, my breath misting in the cold. The loop repeated, and again the subtle, unsettling shift in vocal timbre. One phone's recording, when played back later, would reveal a slightly different voice than the other, even though they had been recording the exact same sound at the exact same time, from the exact same location. I checked the trail logbook, kept in a small, weather-resistant box near the trailhead. Hikers were encouraged to sign in and out, providing a rough record of who was on the trail. I flipped through the recent entries. There were several missing log entries from the past few days, pages that appeared to have been torn out or were simply gone. This was not entirely uncommon, but combined with the radio anomaly, it felt significant. The cold seemed to deepen, seeping into my bones. The isolation of the forest pressed in from all sides. I returned to the cabin, the recordings secured. I filed a detailed report with the county sheriff's office and the local RCMP detachment. I included the audio files from both my personal phones and the official dispatch recorder, highlighting the discrepancies. I also noted the missing logbook entries at the Gap trailhead. The incident was logged as an unexplained radio anomaly, possibly related to atmospheric conditions or equipment malfunction. Search and rescue teams were dispatched to the general area, but after several days of searching the trail and surrounding forest, they found no evidence of a lost hiker, no signs of distress, and no one was reported missing who matched the description of a young male. The official conclusion attributed the differing voice timbres to a rare form of radio interference, a phenomenon that could subtly alter vocal characteristics over long distances or through specific atmospheric conditions. The missing logbook entries were deemed unrelated, a common occurrence in remote trail registers. The case was eventually closed, filed away in the archives. I kept my personal recordings, listening to them occasionally, trying to reconcile the two distinct voices with the identical message. The sound of that static, the differing voices, still lingers. I sometimes hear it in the quiet of the night, a faint whisper in the back of my mind. I was the crew chief for a section of the Appalachian Trail, responsible for maintenance and signage. It was late autumn, the air barely above freezing, and a thick fog had settled over the ridge. We were on a routine night run, checking trail markers after a recent reroute, when I first noticed something was off. The headlamp beam cut a narrow path through the dense fog, illuminating the wet leaves and the occasional frost-covered branch. Our task involved verifying every mile marker along a newly designated stretch, ensuring accuracy for hikers. This particular section wound through a remote saddle, known for its challenging terrain and sudden weather shifts. The radio in my pack crackled with static, a constant companion in these isolated areas. We had just passed the marker designated 17.3 on our first sweep, noting its position and condition. The paint was fresh, the numbers clear against the weathered wood. There was a specific hum in the air that night, a low, almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was the kind of night where the forest felt particularly alive yet utterly silent. The cold seeped into our gear, making every movement deliberate. We continued our descent, planning to loop back and re-verify the markers on our return trip. The gravel underfoot crunched softly, the only consistent sound besides our breathing. The isolation was profound, a common feature of these deep woods. Our crew typically consisted of 3 people for night runs, ensuring safety and efficiency. We carried standard-issue GPS units, satellite phones, and two-way radios for communication with dispatch. The Appalachian Trail is a living entity, constantly shifting with weather, erosion, and human impact. Reroutes are common, sometimes necessary to protect fragile ecosystems or improve safety. Each marker represents a precise location, crucial for navigation, especially for long-distance hikers. Our job was to ensure these markers were correctly placed, visible, and accurately reflected in our digital mapping systems. We cross-referenced physical markers with GPS coordinates, taking photographs of each one for our records. This procedural approach minimized errors and provided a clear audit trail. The work was demanding but straightforward, often performed in challenging conditions. We had encountered everything from sudden blizzards to flash floods, but never anything that defied simple explanation. The forest at night has its own rhythm, a symphony of rustles and whispers that become familiar over time. We trusted our equipment and our training implicitly. Our route that night covered about 3 miles of the new trail, a loop that brought us back to our starting point near a small trailhead parking area. The integrity of the trail system depended on our meticulous attention to detail. After completing the lower section of the loop, we began our ascent back towards the saddle. The fog remained thick, creating a halo around our headlamps, making the world feel compressed and intimate. The air grew colder as we gained elevation, the frost on the trees becoming more pronounced. We were nearing the point where we expected to re-encounter the 17.3 marker. My GPS unit confirmed our position, showing us approaching the recorded waypoint. As the beam of my headlamp swept across the trailside, it landed on the familiar wooden post. The paint was still fresh, the marker clearly visible, but the numbers were wrong. Instead of 17.3, the marker now read 13.7. I stopped abruptly, my breath catching in the cold air. My 2 crew members, walking a few paces behind me, also paused. We had all seen the marker on the way down. We had photographed it. I pulled out my field tablet, bringing up the earlier photograph. The image clearly showed 17.3. I then checked the GPS track. It confirmed we were at the exact location where we had previously recorded 17.3. The device showed no deviation, no error message. My crew member Mark shined his light on the post, then back at his own GPS. His unit displayed the same information as mine. The other crew member, Sarah, pulled out her phone, checking the time-stamped photo she had taken. It was undeniably 17.3. We stood there for a few long moments, the only sounds the faint static from the radio and the drip of condensation from the trees. The cold seemed to deepen, pressing in on us. This was not a simple misreading. The digits had physically reversed. It was not a new post, nor was it a new coat of paint. The wood grain, the small imperfections, everything matched the earlier photograph. The only change was the order of the numbers. I ran my gloved hand over the painted surface. It felt dry, smooth, exactly as it should. There was no sign of tampering, no smudges, no indication that someone had painted over it. The paint appeared to be the same application as before. We checked the surrounding area, sweeping our lights through the undergrowth. There were no footprints other than our own, no discarded paint cans, no tools. The ground was undisturbed. The fog seemed to thicken around us, making the forest feel even more enclosed. The silence, which had been familiar, now felt oppressive. We tried to rationalize it. Perhaps we had misread it the first time, but 3 of us, independently, had recorded 17.3 and photographed it. Perhaps the GPS was faulty, but all 3 units showed the same consistent data, confirming the location of 17.3 at this very spot. The discrepancy was absolute. The physical marker contradicted our documented evidence, yet our documented evidence also contradicted itself. I took new photographs of the 13.7 marker, ensuring the GPS coordinates were embedded in the metadata. We spent a good half hour at that spot, meticulously examining every detail. The air grew heavier. The hum I had noticed earlier seemed to intensify, a low thrumming beneath the silence. It was not a sound I could pinpoint, more of a sensation. The isolation of the ridge saddle felt more profound than usual. We considered calling dispatch, but what would we report? Mile marker digits swapped order? It sounded absurd, like a trick of the light, but we knew it wasn't. The evidence was tangible, yet impossible. The cold was a constant presence, a sharp reminder of our exposed position. We decided to proceed with the rest of our loop, planning to re-examine the marker on a third pass if necessary. The remaining markers on the trail were all in order, consistent with our maps and previous checks. This made the 13.7 anomaly even more unsettling. As we completed the full circuit and approached the saddle for the third time, a sense of quiet dread settled over us. The fog had begun to thin slightly, revealing the faint outlines of distant trees, but the immediate area around the marker remained shrouded. My headlamp cut through the mist, and there it was again. The marker now read 17.3. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Mark and Sarah exchanged a look of profound disbelief. We had not touched the marker. No one else had been on the trail. We had been the only ones out there for hours. I immediately pulled out my field tablet. The new photograph, taken just an hour earlier, clearly showed 13.7. The original photograph from the first pass showed 17.3. Now, on the third pass, it was 17.3 again. The GPS track, consistent throughout, showed we were at the same exact waypoint for all three observations. We spent another extended period at the marker, our initial confusion giving way to a deeper, more unsettling bewilderment. We took more photographs, documenting the 17.3 reading, along with the embedded GPS data. We checked the paint again, feeling for any difference, any sign of manipulation. There was none. It was as if the numbers had simply rearranged themselves. The hum in the air seemed to pulse, a low frequency that vibrated through the soles of my boots. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. We tried to radio dispatch, but the static was heavier than usual, making communication impossible. The radio was effectively blacked out in that specific saddle. Back at the trailhead, we reviewed all our data. The photographs were irrefutable. The GPS tracks were consistent. Our logbook entries detailed each observation. The team debated whether to trust the GPS track, which consistently showed the same location for 17.3, or the paint on the marker, which had inexplicably shifted. The procedural guidelines offered no explanation for such an event. We considered every possibility: a prank, a hallucination, equipment malfunction. But 3 separate individuals, 3 separate GPS units, and multiple time-stamped photographs all corroborated the impossible sequence of events. I drafted a detailed incident report, attaching all the photographic evidence and GPS exports. The report outlined the observations in a factual, procedural manner, avoiding any speculative language. It simply stated what we saw, what we recorded, and the discrepancies. The isolation of the trail, the dense fog, the radio blackout, all contributed to an atmosphere of profound unease. We were trained to handle the unexpected, but this was beyond our training. It was a quiet violation of physical reality. The cold seemed to linger in our bones even after we returned to the warmth of the cabin. The incident report was filed with the Regional Trail Authority. It was met with a degree of skepticism, as expected. The official response suggested a possible misreading in the fog, or perhaps a momentary GPS glitch, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Our photographs were archived, the GPS data stored, but no further action was taken. The marker itself was eventually replaced as part of a scheduled maintenance cycle a few weeks later, removing the physical evidence. For weeks afterward, the memory of that night lingered. The quiet dread, the impossible shift of the numbers, the pervasive hum in the fog. It challenged our understanding of the trail, of our work, and of the natural world itself. We continued our night runs, but a subtle shift had occurred. The forest no longer felt entirely familiar. There was an unspoken understanding among the crew that something unexplainable had happened. The experience left a quiet mark, a subtle alteration in how we perceived the reliability of our instruments and our own senses. Sometimes, when I am alone on the trail at night, and the fog rolls in thick and silent, I still feel that low hum in the air. I find myself checking the mile markers twice, then a third time, just to be sure. The memory of those shifting digits, the cold, the isolation, it all comes back. It is a quiet whisper from the forest, a reminder that some things simply do not fit into our maps or our logbooks. I was a ridge runner for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp chill before sunrise. A faint metallic ping echoed from the shelter roof, a sound I had heard before. My job involved patrolling a specific section of the Appalachian Trail, maintaining shelters and assisting hikers. This particular stretch was remote, often seeing only a few backpackers each week, even fewer during the colder months. The nearest paved road was a drive of about 40 minutes down a winding gravel track. My small cabin, a basic structure with a wood stove and a shortwave radio, served as my base camp. I would spend several days out on the trail, checking conditions, clearing blowdowns, and noting any unusual activity in the logbook. The isolation was a core part of the experience, a quiet solitude that most ridge runners came to appreciate. I carried a small audio recorder and a trail camera for documenting observations, standard equipment for my role. The forest was usually still at night, save for the rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. This stillness made any unnatural sound stand out with stark clarity. The first time I heard the pings, it was a few weeks prior, during a routine overnight stay at the shelter. I had been asleep for a few hours when a distinct metallic tapping began directly above my head. It sounded like someone was lightly stepping on the corrugated aluminum roof. The pattern was irregular, a few quick steps, then a pause, then another series of pings. I lay still, listening, trying to rationalize it. Wind could cause branches to scrape, but this was too precise, too rhythmic in its pauses. The air outside was calm, barely a whisper of a breeze. I waited for a few minutes. Then the sounds stopped as abruptly as they had started. I dismissed it as an animal, perhaps a raccoon or a squirrel, although the weight implied by the sound seemed too heavy for either. The next morning, I found no tracks on the roof or around the shelter. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for showing prints, but there was nothing. I made a brief note in my personal logbook, attributing it to an unknown animal. This time, the pings returned with a chilling familiarity. I was at the same shelter about 3 weeks after the first incident. The night was clear and cold, with a thin layer of frost already forming on the exposed surfaces of the forest floor. I had set up my trail camera facing the shelter entrance, and another pointing towards the roofline, just in case. The audio recorder was running inside. I had settled into my sleeping bag, the hum of the forest a steady background. Around, a little past midnight, the first ping sounded. It was a sharp, distinct metallic tick, directly above the sleeping platform. Then another, and another, moving in a slow, deliberate stepping pattern across the roof. The sound was unmistakable, a series of light impacts, each one resonating through the thin aluminum. It was not the random scurry of a small animal. This was heavier, more intentional. I could almost visualize the weight shifting with each step. I lay perfectly still, my breath held, listening to the progression of the pings. They moved from one end of the shelter roof to the other, then paused for a long moment. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sounds themselves. Then, the steps began again, retracing their path. This time, they seemed to move slightly faster, a quick succession of pings, then another pause. My mind raced through possibilities. A large bird, perhaps? An owl or a hawk landing heavily? But the pattern was too consistent, too much like a bipedal movement. The air outside was absolutely still, not a breath of wind to stir the branches. The cold seeped into the shelter, making the metallic sounds even sharper. I could feel the vibration through the wooden frame of the sleeping platform. The sounds continued for what felt like several minutes, a slow, methodical pacing above me. Then, just like before, they ceased. The sudden return to silence was almost more unnerving than the pings themselves. I remained awake for a long time, listening intently, but the sounds did not resume. The isolation of the forest pressed in, the darkness outside the shelter entrance feeling particularly dense. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, I began my investigation. The ground around the shelter was covered in a fresh, light dusting of snow that had fallen sometime after midnight. This was ideal for tracking. I checked the perimeter first. There were no human footprints in the snow, not even faint impressions. The only tracks belonged to deer and a few small rodents, far from the shelter walls. I scanned the trees for any signs of a ladder or climbing equipment. Nothing. The shelter walls were smooth, offering no purchase for climbing without aid. I then focused on the roof itself. The snow cover was thin but unbroken. There were no indentations, no scuff marks, no signs of anything having landed or walked on the aluminum surface. The only marks were faint scratches, consistent with small birds landing and taking off. It was as if the sounds I had heard had left no physical trace. I retrieved the trail cameras. The one facing the shelter entrance showed nothing but the empty forest. The camera pointed at the roofline, however, had captured something. The video was dark, but the infrared illumination showed the roof clearly. During the time the pings had occurred, there was nothing visible on the roof. No animal, no person, no object. The surface remained pristine, covered in its thin layer of snow. I reviewed the audio recorder. The metallic pings were clear, exactly as I remembered them. The sound was distinct, a series of impacts, each one followed by a slight metallic resonance. The rhythm was undeniable, a stepping motion. The audio evidence contradicted the visual evidence. This discrepancy was deeply unsettling. I spent the rest of the morning meticulously searching the area, expanding my search radius to about a quarter mile. I found no discarded equipment, no unusual tracks leading into or out of the area, no signs of a camp. The forest was quiet, undisturbed. I hiked out that day, making my way back to my cabin. The radio crackled with static as I tried to reach dispatch, but the signal was weak. I eventually got through and filed a detailed report. I described the sounds, the lack of physical evidence, and the conflicting audio and visual recordings. The dispatcher listened patiently, then advised me to keep a closer watch and to report any further incidents. They noted it in my logbook as unexplained activity. My supervisor later reviewed the report and the recordings. He had no explanation either. He suggested it might be a unique acoustic phenomenon, perhaps related to temperature changes causing the metal to expand and contract. But the stepping pattern on the audio made that explanation feel inadequate. The incident was officially filed as an anomaly, with no further action taken. I continued my patrols, but the experience changed something. The quiet isolation of the forest no longer felt entirely peaceful. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth, made me pause and listen. I still work as a ridge runner, and I still visit that shelter. I always set up my cameras and audio recorder now. The pings have not returned to that specific shelter. But sometimes, late at night, in other remote locations, I hear faint, distant sounds that remind me of those metallic ticks. I still hear it sometimes, in the deep quiet of the forest. A sound without a source,